I'm Admiral Samuel Francis Dupont. His nickname in the Navy was the Aristocrat. I was the first admiral in the United States Navy. I went to sea at the age of 11 before there was a Naval Academy. My commission was signed by Thomas Jefferson, an old family friend. In the Mexican War, my ship was part of the amphibious invasion at Veracruz, which gave me experience that came in handy much later. When President Lincoln took office, I was only 58 years old and I had nearly 47 years of sea service, and 80% of it was at sea. I had sailed all over the world, including Japan and China, and I was one of the senior captains in the Navy when the highest rank was Commodore, and we had one, Commodore Stillwell. When the war first started, I was assigned to the Navy Yard at Brooklyn, and Secretary Wells called me to Washington to sit as the senior officer on the board of blockades to help organize the blockades, secure ships, men, and material. President Lincoln, with a Navy of 65 ships at the time, wanted to block 3,500 miles of coastline from the Chesapeake Bay to Brownsville, Texas. So we had quite a task in front of us. The first military action I took part in, while sitting on the board, we realized we needed bases to support our fleet on the southern coast. At first, we considered Mud Bay in South Carolina, which is a little north of Charleston, but we settled on Port Royal. Port Royal had such a big roadstead, which is where ships lay at anchor until they can come into the port. It could handle 100 vessels. The port itself was large, and it's where the Broad River in South Carolina, which runs through the center of the state, including their capital, Columbia, enters the ocean. And it also had the advantage of being protected by barrier islands from the Atlantic storms. I accepted command, and it was to be an Army-Navy operation. As a captain, my rank in the Army would have been colonel. The Army commander was a Major General Thomas Sherman. So Congress authorized me to be promoted to the rank of flag officer equal to Major General. And that's how the United States Navy got admirals. During the course of the Civil War, there were only 6 of us. When we put together the expedition in New York to go to Port Royal, I had a collection of 75 ships, and over half the ships my sailors and I looked at and wondered how they floated, let alone could they make it at sea. They were a strange collection. I'd been adamant that we had to leave before the 1st of September because from September to June in the Atlantic, there are these great storms that come up that the Spanish called hurricanes. We left New York on the 29th of October. Off Cape Hatteras, we hit a hurricane. My ship, the Susquehanna, was a stout ship. I wasn't worried. She bounced around a lot, and we took on so much water that everything on board was soaking wet, including my personal belongings and papers. And the next morning, when the sun came out and the sea was calm, there was not another sail or ship in sight. I proceeded to my rendezvous point off of South Carolina, and over the course of 2 days, 7 other Navy vessels joined me. We formed a column and steamed straight into Port Royal's harbor past Confederate fortifications on the north and south side of the harbor. The fortifications on the south side were larger, and that's where I concentrated my fire. I had my ships steam in column. We were 800 yards off the Confederate fort, and we fired as our guns bared, which means as the gun came across from the fort, it would fire. We entered the roadstead, which was so large that out of range of these guns, I ordered come about to port, which is the same thing in the Army as a countermarch to the left. We went past the fort again, concentrating on the northern fortifications at 600 yards. Our ships mounted 9 and 11-inch Dahlgren guns, and we had exploding shells for the first time. As we passed the fort, we saw mounds of dirt being thrown up in the air, broken logs, gun carriages, gun tubes, and bodies. Clearing the harbor, I ordered to come about to starboard to go back in, and the rebels were abandoning their positions as fast as they could. We entered the harbor itself, and before I dropped anchor, the townspeople came out and surrendered to us. So General Thomas, who happened to be on the flagship with 50 soldiers out of a regiment, went ashore to take possession with the help of my Marines. And his transports began to show up over the next couple of weeks. The hurricane had blown them all the way to the Azore Islands off the coast of Africa. This came within a day or two of the news of General Burnside taking Cape Hatteras, denying the South the use of Amamari Sound and most of the North Carolina coast. And on November the 5th, Captain John Wilkes arrested 2 Confederate agents off HMS Trent and nearly started a war with England. And it probably saved President Lincoln's administration because the country's morale and resolve was very low after the disaster that fall at the first Bull Run. Personally, President Lincoln was my commander-in-chief. I didn't particularly care for him. That's the way it was. General Thomas Sherman, I do not know if he was any relation to William Sherman. I would have to check on that. In General McClellan's campaign, and George McClellan was one of my best friends, at the Battle of Malvern Hill, General McClellan rode out that morning to have breakfast with me and discuss his plans when General Lee made his attack on Malvern Hill. Throughout the battle, George was right there on the quarterdeck with me conducting the whole Battle of Malvern Hill. And General Lee and his generals didn't seem to like my 9-inch Dahlgren guns. The Susquehanna did good service that day. So I'm the only admiral that has successfully held battle with the Army in Northern Virginia and won. It was also the Navy's gunfire, which truthfully wasn't that accurate, but the men were so afraid of it that General Lee stayed away from the coast after that. My capture at Port Royal proved that the old truth that no ship stood a chance against a fort was thrown out the window. With steamships and big guns, we had the advantage again. And this was the beginning of the change in naval history. And my friend David Farragut looked at my battle very carefully, and I'm sure that's where he got the idea of running the guns on the Mississippi and the way he handled his battle of Mobile Bay. As far as after the campaign, Secretary Wells and President Lincoln ordered me to make an attack on Fort Sumter with 4 monitors. After the Merrimack and the Monitor's duel, they fell in love with those little ships and felt they were the answer to all their problems. I explained to them that Charleston wasn't as big as Port Royal, and the Monitor's rate of fire was 1 round every 10 minutes, totally unsuited for bombardment. I even visited President Lincoln 2 weeks before that attack and explained it to him, but unfortunately his son has just died, so I think he was a little distracted. And when I got back to Charleston, I had orders to make the attack. After 4 hours of bombardment by 6 monitors, I asked Captain Warren for a report, and he said, well, we broke every window in the place and knocked a few bricks loose. So I called the attack back. Mr. Bennett of one of the New York newspapers began to refer to me as the Navy's version of McClellan, and in January of 1863, partly at my own request, I was relieved of command. The command was supposed to go to Admiral Foote, who had done good service on the rivers in Mississippi, but he died of wounds he received. And President Lincoln reached down and promoted Commander John Dahlgren to Rear Admiral and gave him the fleet, much to the dismay of the Navy. But Admiral Dahlgren did prove to be a good choice. I died in November of 1863 with a heart attack in Philadelphia. And in a newspaper interview in the fall, I was asked what my opinion was on slavery, since my uncle down in Delaware had owned slaves. And to this day, I'll tell you, after seeing the evils of that institution with my own two eyes, I take back every word I ever said in its defense or may have said. Thank you.